All right, in this lesson, we'll begin our exploration of variables. What is a variable? A variable is a reference to an object. Another word that is commonly used for it is a placeholder as well as a pointer or an identifier. So as we've discussed previously, almost everything in Ruby is an object, and an object is just a thing or a data structure within a programming language. So a string is an example of an object. A number is an example of an object in Ruby. A floating point number with a decimal component is an example of an object in Ruby. And a variable is basically just a placeholder name that we can give to a certain object, such as a string, so that instead of having to write it out each and every time, we can simply use something that acts as a reference to that object or a pointer to that object. It's important to iterate now that the variable itself is not an object, it's simply a placeholder. It's an alternate name that we can use to refer to an object such as a number or a string. Ruby is dynamically typed. If you're coming into this course without any previous experience in programming, that kind of sounds like something bizarre. But in other programming languages, whenever you use variables and declare variables, you have to specify what data type you're using. So whenever you create a variable, you have to say, this pointer is going to point to a number like an integer or a string. In Ruby, that does not have to happen. It is not required. So variable types do not have to be declared. You simply write the name that you'd like to give to your variable, and then you point it or assign it to whatever it's going to be representing or serving as a placeholder for. So the same variable in Ruby can be assigned to objects of different data types. So the same variable can point to an integer or a number, and then it can later point to a string in the exact same program, the exact same variable. We'll see how this works in the code editor in just a second. So I'm going to show you some syntax for creating a variable. We can see it appear right here on the box on the top right. These are just 4 separate variable declarations. And we can see here that the syntax is fairly similar for all of them. We begin with the variable name, or the placeholder name that we'd like to create. Here I have 4 of them: name, last name, handsome, and age. I followed those variable names with an equal sign, and on the equal sign I write the object that I'd like to point that placeholder or that variable to. So in the first example, Boris, which is a string, is what the name variable is pointing to. In the second example, my last name Passcaver as a string is what the last name variable is pointing to. The third example introduces something new, which is a Boolean. We'll dive into that in much greater detail in future lessons. But a Boolean is basically a value that's equal to either true or false. It's not the same thing as a string. You can see that true there is not written in double quotes. But you can see that the same variable logic applies. We have handsome on the left side of the equal sign. That's our variable name. And on the right side of the equal sign, we have the object that that variable is pointing to. And on the bottom line, we have the exact same thing. We have a variable called age, and it's pointing to an expression on the right side of the equal sign, 24 plus 1. So variables are pointed to objects with the equal sign. The right side of the equal sign is always evaluated first. The only real example here that demonstrates this is the very last one. You can see we have age equal to 24 plus 1. What Ruby is going to do is evaluate 24 plus 1. It's going to give 25 as the final result, and that object, that number of 25, is what age the variable is going to point to or reference to. So whatever happens on the right side is always going to happen first. That evaluation completes entirely before anything is assigned to a variable. Similarly, if we had some kind of concatenation operation, if we had something like 2 strings being combined with the plus operator, the plus sign, those 2 strings would first be concatenated, and then that final result, that new string object, would be what that variable on the left side of the equal sign would point to. Variable names should start with a lowercase letter or an underscore. You can see in the examples above, all of my variables start with lowercase letters. That's a best practice. In addition, spaces are not allowed. That breaks up the variable name. So whenever you have to use spaces, such as in last name, you use underscores instead. We can see here between last and name I've placed an underscore. And this type of typing or formatting is called lower snake case. What that means is that everything is lowercase and words are separated by underscores. The reason it's called snake case is because whenever you have a bunch of words and they're all separated by underscores, it sort of resembles a snake. So that's where that name comes from. But this format that we see right here with last name is called lower snake case, and you should follow it whenever you are writing variable names. Separate each word, each lowercase word, with a underscore. Variable names are case sensitive. What that means is that if I had a variable with a capital A here, if I had name with N, capital A, M-E, and I pointed it to something different, that would be a completely separate variable and a completely separate reference. So you have to be careful, because if you use variables and one of them has a different casing in one of the letters than another one does, that's going to run into all kinds of errors in your code. So the general recommendation is to not ever have any variable names repeat with different casings. Just follow a consistent casing, which is all lowercase, and don't reuse the same variables over and over again with different casings. That's just begging for errors in your program. So now, the last thing that I want to show you before we dive immediately into the code editor is just to not use any of Ruby's reserved keywords in any of your variable names. So far we've really only used a couple keywords or methods in Ruby. We've used puts or print and p. Basically, don't use those as variable names. We can see in the example above we use name, last name, handsome, and age. I didn't name any variable print or puts or any of the other 40 plus Ruby keywords that exist in the language. Again, it just makes it confusing for the language to figure out what you want to do if print both means a command to output text and also a variable name that's pointing to some kind of string. So don't ever use any of Ruby's reserved keywords in your variable names. Of course, having a variable name like print underscore something is totally okay because it's different, but don't use any literal Ruby keywords like literally puts or literally print as your variable name to avoid any errors. So now let's dive into the Ruby editor in Atom and take a look at variables in action. All right, so now we're in our Atom text editor, and let's basically replicate what I just wrote in my slide presentation. So I'm going to write name, which is going to represent my variable. I'm calling it name. That's entirely my choice. I can choose whatever variable name I want as long as it begins with a letter or an underscore and is all lowercase. So this could be name, this could be first name, this could be blah, blah. Name is just my name for a variable. And on the right side of the equal sign, I write the object that I want that variable to refer to. So I can write something like Boris. That's a string. That's a valid string. And let's try another example below. I'm going to create a variable name called last name, and that's going to refer to my last name, Passcaver. You can, of course, fill these strings in with your own first name and last name. These are just random strings that I've created, random string objects that I'm assigning these variables to or pointing these variables to. And let's do another thing. Let's do handsome, which is, again, just a variable name. This could be beautiful or charming, whatever you want. I'm just calling it handsome. I'm going to do the equal sign. That is the common syntax for pointing a variable to an object. And on the right side of the equal sign, I simply write what I want that variable or placeholder to point to. Again, this is called a Boolean. We'll dive into it in more detail later. For now, you can simply write true. And below, I'm going to write age, which is going to be another variable name. Again, all lowercase, equals to point it to something. And now I'm going to point it to an expression or an operation, which is going to be 24 plus 1. So again, this is going to be calculated to 25, and then Ruby is going to take age and point it to 25. So what is the advantage of variables? Well, variables store information. They store or point to objects, and we can use that so we don't have to recall exactly what something is referencing. For example, if I forget my name, but I remember that it's stored in name, I could write puts, and instead of writing it out as a string, I can simply write puts name. And what Ruby is going to do is look up name. It's going to find it declared above right here, and it's going to substitute it with whatever string I've pointed name to. So when I execute this, you'll see that Boris is going to output right here. Similarly, if I do something like puts last name, we can see that the string that's last name is pointing to is now going to appear in my Atom Runner output to the right. And operations are equally doable. So for example, if I wanted to combine those two strings, what I can do is do puts name plus last name. This is literally the exact same thing as writing puts Boris plus passkey verb. But again, variables allow us to have a little bit of an easier time because we can simply write the variable name and it can reference something like a much longer string or a much longer mathematical operation and just make it easier for us so I don't have to type it out each time. But this is going to basically give us the exact same result. We can see it outputted both of these lines on the right here. I'm just going to remove this one. And what we can even do here is just add an additional string in between. So variables don't have to necessarily just be concatenated in this case with other variables. We can do something like name plus a string with a space plus, and then the last name variable. And what that's going to do is output Boris. It's going to concatenate an space to the end of that. And then it's going to concatenate the string in last name. It's going to get that final result. And that's what's going to be output to my Atom Runner view right here. Let's take a look at another example. Let's output the value in the handsome variable. So I'm going to do puts handsome, and it's going to give me true. And I can similarly output age, and what this is going to do is allow us to see that age is in fact equal to 25. So Ruby has taken this expression, evaluated it, and given me a new number that's 25. And because this is a number, what we can actually do is do mathematical operations. A lesson ago we explored how to do mathematical operations. So we can do something like puts age plus 5. It may seem kind of wonky at first because you're seeing this word plus 5, and certainly if we did something like a string like puts age plus 5, let me just comment this line of code out for now, we would get an error because this time we're trying to add the number 5 to a string with the character's age. But this is different. This age right here does not represent a string. Age is simply the variable name that's storing the result of this operation, which is 24 plus 1. So Ruby is going to substitute this placeholder of age with the number 25, which we got from right here. It's then going to add 5 to it to get 30, and we're going to get 30 output right here. So we can do something like age plus 5, and that's going to perform that operation. Age, again, is just a variable name. It's a word to us, but to the computer, it's just a placeholder that points to something. In this case, it's pointing to an operation of 24 plus 1. As I mentioned in the slide deck, Ruby has dynamic typing, which means that variables can be reassigned, and they can be reassigned to different types of objects. Now, of course, variables can be reassigned to the same types of objects. So, for example, if I output just age by itself, we can see that age is currently equal to 25. What I can do is set age equal to something different. I can do age equals 50. And this assignment on line 15 is going to overwrite what was the assignment on line number 4. So when I output age immediately below, age is now going to equal 50. So variables are called variables because they vary, because they can change their values. So we can see that age here went from being 25 to being 50. What makes Ruby unique is that the data type that a variable points to can change as well. So for example, if I have a variable called favorite number, and I'm going to point it to a number object, which is 24, we can see if I output favorite number, there it is right here, 24. What I can actually do is reassign favorite number to a totally different object type. I can reassign it to a string like 24. And now when I output favorite number, we can see here in the output that 24 has appeared. We can see it's a string. I've used the p method and those double quotes have appeared. And this is a totally different object type compared to the number above, which is 24. So variables can be pointed and repointed to objects of different types. That basically is what dynamic typing means, and Ruby is a dynamically typed language. So that is a quick introduction to variables. We'll certainly be diving into this in much greater detail. So I'll see you in the next lesson.